Hello, AP Psychology. Welcome to part 2 of psychoanalytic theory, or the psychodynamic perspective in understanding personality. I'd like you to pause the video for a moment and actually answer the questions here. Who are these people? What has happened? What will happen? What is being thought? It's a serious question, and I'd actually like you to write down the answer. So pause the video and take a minute and think about this picture and write down your response. You'll need it later. Okay, today we're going to talk about two things, the Neo-Freudians and how a personality is assessed in the psychodynamic perspective. The word neo, of course, means new, and so these are people who have taken most of Freud's basic ideas but have a little bit of a different emphasis than Freud had. Most psychologists that I know believe that Freud had a lot of important things to say. But the Neo-Freudians as a whole focus on social tensions, those within family and society, rather than on sex and aggression as being the root of behavior and thoughts. They do support the use of defense mechanisms, and they will use the same terms that we talked about yesterday in regards to defense mechanisms. And they also agree that the unconscious and early childhood experiences have a great impact on personality. One of the early Neo-Freudians was Alfred Adler. He actually met Freud. He was a little bit younger than Freud, and he had some problems with Freud's theory, especially regarding the overabundant, what he thought, emphasis on sex and aggression. However, he did come up with the notion of an inferiority complex. He believed that inferiority complexes were actually quite common because of children's small size. So they're constantly looking up to older and bigger people, and they develop this complex about being inferior. Some people can healthily outgrow that, and others do not. He also was the one that introduced the concept of birth order and how that might affect your personality development, as well as sibling rivalry and how that affects your personality. What's interesting about Alfred Adler is while his work is about 100 years old, or maybe just a little bit less, psychologists continue to look at how birth order impacts us and how siblings impact us. And as it turns out, research shows that especially sibling rivalry can have a huge impact on our development, especially if we have a sibling who is potentially very strong-willed or difficult, or requires an extra amount of attention for some other reason. This can have an impact on your personality development. Another Neo-Freudian was a feminist named Karen Horney. She, in particular, broke with Freud over his male bias. Freud actually believed that men had stronger superegos than women, so he actually believed that men had a stronger moral conscience than women, and she just didn't agree with him on that. She also emphasized the importance of social relationships and how those indeed are the greatest influence on our lives, while not completely ignoring the influence of the unconscious. And finally, she believed that an individual's basic anxiety goes back to a negative parent-to-child relationship and a lack of secure attachment from a young age. What's interesting about Karen Horney's theories is while she was not able to scientifically test them at the time that she was alive, there really wasn't good methodology at that time. The importance of a secure attachment at the young age has been very, very well documented in long-term studies that we'll look at in the development unit. And then finally, we have Carl Jung. Carl Jung was a brilliant, brilliant man who studied multiple cultures. Now, you could take a graduate course on Carl Jung. You could do a PhD on the works of Carl Jung, and I'm going to be mentioning him on another video when it comes to trait theory. But he had an idea that to some of you might sound kind of strange. But let's see if I can explain it. So according to Carl Jung, we have two separate unconscious regions. One of them is our personal unconscious. That's what we are born with. That's what we develop through our early childhood experiences. The other one he called the collective unconscious. Now, what was interesting about Carl Jung is he did go into a variety of places around the world, and he studied people and had them tell stories while they were taking a hallucinogenic drug. Now, this sounds really, really weird, and it is kind of. But what was interesting about what he found is that the stories that he heard from various cultures all around the world had many of the same themes. So he believed that there's a part of our unconscious that is universal, that it is there regardless of where we grow up or what culture we live in. And part of this are archetypes, recurring stories across time and place, and the other or part of the archetypes are characters such as the hero and the scapegoat. And Disney has certainly, capitalized on the concept of archetypes in their movies. Another common theme, and I know this is obscured by my picture, but it's a situation. Many of the stories that he heard had to do with a quest or a task that one needed to complete. Now, he also developed something called the principle of opposites, and this is where you come up with your Myers-Briggs score based on Jung typology, and I will talk about that in another video. All right, so let's take another look at some pictures. I do not expect you to write down your response to this, but I would just like you to think for a second about who these people are, what they're doing, what's happening, what led to this situation. I showed you this picture in the video on motivation when I was talking about need for achievement. Here's another picture, and now these pictures are intentionally ambiguous. However, over the years, when I've showed this picture to people in class, people have said a woman comes home and she finds her husband drunk and passed out on the bed, and it makes her very sad. Somebody once, though, said a woman comes home, she opens the door, and she's so surprised to see her husband, who has been serving in the military, has made a surprise return home. So you can tell that people will have very different responses to these ambiguous pictures. Here's another one. And I haven't really done this one much in class, so I don't actually know what most people would say about this one. Now, some of you are maybe aware of something called the Rorschach inkblot. I'm going to show you 6 of them. And basically what's done when someone is shown the Rorschach inkblot test is they are shown a picture, and they're asked to describe what they think the picture represents. Some examples I've seen for this one are a crown or a frog. I've seen people say, well, you think about what you think for that one. I won't say what I hear people say about that one. There's some common answers for this one as well. This one is one of the 2 that are in color, and I've seen some really interesting responses to this one as well. Number 5 and number 6. Now, these don't seem terribly meaningful because really you could make an ink black by just, putting some tempera paint on a piece of paper, folding it in half, squishing it, opening it up, and you have an ink blot, right? You just have some shapes. Why do people use these? Well, let's talk about assessing personality in psychoanalysis. What we use is something called a projective test. So the idea is that you are using the defense mechanism of projection to uncover the unconscious. So in other words, you're projecting your own unconscious onto the image, whether it be one of the ambiguous pictures that I showed you or an ink blot. There are 2 types of projective tests. one is called the thematic apperception test. I showed you 4 pictures from the TAT is what it's called. And in an actual testing situation, you would tell stories of 20 to 30 ambiguous pictures. Now, as you can imagine, you can get a little bit of an idea of one schema by hearing what people say about 20 to 30 pictures. You can't get an idea from just one picture, but looking at several pictures, if they are all negative, if they all involve abuse, or if they're all positive, or they all have a positive spin, you get an idea how one sees and experiences the world. We look for themes in the response, and we look for who the teller identifies with in the picture. The other test is called the Rorschach inkblot. Now, many people have heard of these before. It's a series of 10 inkblots. They really are pretty well protected, so the real ones are hard to find online. This particular one is one of the actual original 10 inkblots. Now, people who use inkblots have a scale by which they grade them. They look for typical responses. They also look to see whether the person turns the picture or tries to come up with a different kind of interpretation. And then, of course, just like with the thematic apperception test, they're looking for themes. Now, I'll tell you which one is the most highly regarded, of course, is the thematic apperception test, because here we actually have real individuals, real stories that can be told, and not just one's wild imagination based on some inkblots. The Rorschach inkblot test is still used by, some say, up to 80% of psychologists, but they're not used so much to understand one's personality as they are to break the ice and just start talking. Another technique that a psychoanalytic psychologist might use is sentence completion. So, for example, when I see myself in the mirror, and then finish the sentence. My first memory is, and this is important, that's something that I asked you guys to record yourselves, and it's believed by psychoanalytic psychologists that it does reveal something important about the individual. Some will do dream analysis. In other words, they will look for the manifest and the latent content. And our dreams, as it turns out, for many of us, can be a window into the things that are really actually on our mind as we are processing events of our life, especially things that might be scary or discomforting for us or conflict that we're having. And finally, psychologists might use something called free association. And in other words, just say whatever comes to mind. Now, there are some criticisms of the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic approach to understanding personality. And for your lesson tomorrow, for your ABA, you're going to read the pages that I have here, and you're going to record 2 critiques of the psychoanalytic approach. For your ABA today, what I would like you to do is actually record for me what I asked you to do at the very beginning of this screencast, and that is write down your response to the following. So go back to that picture if you did write it down, and just go ahead and type it in the comments box. Remember, no one can see your comments except me, so don't worry about what you write. And that is your ABA for today. So having said that, I will be talking to you next week, and have a great day.